Emperor Akihito of Japan read and reread the letter before him. "Your Excellency," it began, "I humbly request your permission to express my deep admiration for your art and culture." The letter was written by Michael Jackson, and had it leaked to the public, it would have captured headlines worldwide. Despite his advisors' objections, the emperor had made his decision: he would invite the king of pop to the Imperial Palace. This three-day meeting, completely hidden from the world press, would turn a new page in Japanese-American relations and global popular culture. If these kinds of stories catch your attention, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Where are you watching us from right now? Let us know in the comments below. In the autumn of 1992, Michael Jackson was at a complex crossroads in his life and career. His latest album, Dangerous, had been released to commercial success but mixed critical reception. His global fame had reached unprecedented heights, yet he found himself increasingly isolated by that very celebrity. The media scrutiny of his personal life was intensifying, creating a paradoxical existence where he was simultaneously the world's most visible entertainer and a deeply private individual seeking genuine human connection. The early 1990s marked a transitional period in Jackson's artistic development. The carefree energy of his 1980s work was evolving into more complex themes, reflecting his growing social consciousness and personal struggles. His Dangerous World Tour, which had begun in June 1992, took him across Europe and into Asia, giving him brief opportunities to explore cultures beyond the controlled environment of his performances and accommodations. Michael was increasingly drawn to places where he felt he could connect with historical tradition, explained one of his former tour managers who worked with him during this period. He had this sense that contemporary American culture was somehow disconnected from its roots, and he was looking elsewhere for examples of cultural continuity. It was during this period of personal and professional reflection that Jackson developed an intensifying interest in Japanese culture. This wasn't a sudden fascination but rather the deepening of a long-held appreciation. Jackson had toured Japan multiple times since the 1970s, always noting the respectful reception he received there compared to the often invasive attention he experienced in America and Europe. His first visit to Japan had been in 1973 as part of the Jackson 5, and he had returned repeatedly throughout his solo career. Each visit strengthened his affinity for the country and its culture. Japanese fans were renowned for their passionate but disciplined behavior, forming orderly lines that stretched for blocks to purchase his albums or catch a glimpse of him rather than the chaotic mobbing he experienced elsewhere. "Japan was different for Michael," explained one of his former tour managers who requested anonymity. "The fans were passionate but respectful of boundaries. The media was interested but not intrusive in the way Western tabloids were. He could feel the admiration without the aggressive energy that often accompanied fame in other countries." This relative comfort allowed Jackson to experience aspects of Japanese culture that might have been inaccessible amid the security concerns his fame created elsewhere. During his 1987 Bad World Tour shows in Japan, he had been able to arrange private, after-hours visits to several cultural sites, including Buddhist temples in Kyoto and traditional gardens in Tokyo. Beyond this relative comfort, Jackson had developed a genuine appreciation for Japanese artistic traditions. He had begun collecting Japanese art, particularly ukiyo-e prints from the Edo period. He studied the aesthetics of Noh theater and became fascinated by the concept of hama, the Japanese idea of negative space that gives meaning to what surrounds it, a concept that resonated with his own musical sensibilities regarding the importance of silence between notes. Michael talked about how Japanese artistic principles had influenced his understanding of performance, recalled Rob Stringer, a music industry executive who worked with Jackson during this period. He was particularly interested in the economy of movement in traditional Japanese dance and theater, how a single gesture could convey profound meaning when properly executed. You could see him incorporating some of that precision and intentionality into his own choreography. Jackson's interest extended beyond the arts into Japanese philosophy and spirituality. He had begun studying aspects of Zen Buddhism and its emphasis on mindfulness and present-moment awareness. For someone whose life was constantly pulled between past accomplishments and future expectations, these concepts offered a tantalizing promise of centeredness. In September 1992, following a private tour of the Tokyo National Museum arranged by a Japanese business associate, Jackson made an unusual request that would set in motion an extraordinary chain of events. Michael turned to me after seeing the Imperial collection and asked if it would be possible to write to the Emperor, recalled Masato Ishizawa, a well-connected Japanese music executive who had facilitated several of Jackson's visits to Japan. At first, I thought he was joking, but he was completely serious. He said he wanted to express his admiration for Japanese cultural preservation and to ask about certain artistic traditions. The request revealed a side of Jackson that his public persona rarely conveyed, a thoughtful cultural observer with genuine intellectual curiosity. While his global image often emphasized his musical innovation and performance spectacle, those who worked closely with him knew of his wide-ranging interests and self-education in various cultural and historical subjects. Ishizawa, understanding both the audacity and sincerity of the request, cautiously agreed to help draft an appropriate letter that would follow Imperial protocol. What neither of them expected was that the carefully worded letter, expressing Jackson's genuine interest in traditional Japanese arts and their preservation, would receive a response. Emperor Akihito, who had ascended to the chrysanthemum throne just 3 years earlier following the death of his father Emperor Hirohito, was in many ways a modernizing force in the ancient imperial institution. Educated partially in the West and married to Empress Michiko, the first commoner to marry into the imperial family, Akihito had demonstrated an openness to cultural exchange that distinguished him from his predecessors. Akihito's reign, which had begun in 1989, marked a significant shift in the Japanese imperial tradition. Following the long shadow of his father, whose 62-year reign had spanned Japan's militaristic period, World War II, and post-war reconstruction, Akihito sought to redefine the symbolic role of the emperor in contemporary Japanese society. Emperor Akihito was consciously working to make the imperial house more accessible and relevant in modern times, while still preserving its essential traditions, explained Dr. Kenneth Ruoff, a historian specializing in the Japanese imperial institution. He recognized that in a globalized world, cultural exchange was increasingly important, and he was more willing than his predecessors to engage with contemporary culture alongside traditional arts. This openness included an interest in how Japanese culture was perceived and interpreted globally. While maintaining the dignity of his position, Akihito had shown curiosity about contemporary cultural developments and how they related to traditional Japanese arts and values. When Jackson's letter arrived through diplomatic channels in November 1992, it presented the Imperial Household Agency, which manages all matters relating to the emperor's schedule and interactions, with an unprecedented situation. There was no protocol for this, explained a former imperial household official who spoke on condition of anonymity due to the confidential nature of imperial matters. A letter from an American pop star directly to the emperor was simply not something our manual covered. The immediate instinct was to send a polite but distant acknowledgement through junior channels. The Imperial Household Agency, known for its conservatism and careful management of all matters relating to the imperial family, was predictably resistant to the unusual correspondence. Established protocols dictated that communication with the emperor from foreign individuals should pass through diplomatic or governmental channels, not directly from a private citizen, regardless of their prominence. However, the letter found its way to the emperor himself, who reportedly showed unexpected interest. While no transcript of Jackson's original letter has ever been made public, those familiar with it describe a thoughtful, well-researched message that demonstrated genuine knowledge of Japanese artistic traditions and imperial history, far beyond what might be expected from a Western entertainer. The letter was quite extraordinary, said one former imperial secretary who claimed to have seen it. It wasn't the typical celebrity correspondent seeking a photo opportunity or expressing superficial admiration. Jackson had clearly done significant research on Japanese artistic traditions, particularly the imperial court's historical role in preserving cultural practices. He asked specific, informed questions about Gagaku court music and its preservation, about imperial patronage of traditional arts, and about the balance between preservation and innovation in cultural traditions. More surprising was the emperor's reaction. "His Majesty actually recognized Michael Jackson's cultural significance," said the former Imperial household official. He made a comment that was quite profound, that in some ways, artists like Jackson were the modern equivalent of the court musicians and performers who had once been central to Imperial cultural life. He saw a connection across time and tradition that many of us had missed. Emperor Akihito, with his background in marine biology and interest in cultural preservation, had developed a perspective that recognized the importance of contemporary cultural exchange alongside traditional arts. His decision to respond personally to Jackson's letter, and eventually to extend an invitation for a private audience, was met with considerable resistance from the Imperial Household Agency. The debate within the Imperial Household Agency was intense. Conservative officials argued that such a meeting would trivialize the imperial institution by associating it with pop culture and entertainment. They expressed concerns about potential commercialization or exploitation of the emperor's image and the precedent it might set for other celebrities seeking similar access. There were serious concerns about propriety, the former official continued. Would such a meeting diminish the dignity of the imperial institution? Was there a hidden commercial motive? What precedent would it set for other celebrities? The debate was quite heated. Those supporting the emperor's interest argued that Jackson represented a unique case, an artist whose global cultural impact transcended ordinary celebrity and whose demonstrated interest in Japanese traditions appeared genuine rather than opportunistic. They noted that the imperial house had historically engaged with the artistic innovations of each era, and that refusing to recognize contemporary cultural figures reflected an unnecessary rigidity. The emperor, while respectful of tradition and protocol, maintained his position. The resulting compromise was unprecedented. Jackson would be invited for a private audience, but the visit would be conducted with absolute discretion. There would be no public announcements, no press coverage, and a minimal staff presence. It would be, in essence, a private cultural exchange between the emperor and an artist he recognized as culturally significant, regardless of the unconventional nature of that significance. It was a masterful compromise, noted one imperial scholar who later learned of the arrangement. The emperor exercised his prerogative to engage in cultural dialogue while accommodating the legitimate concerns about maintaining the dignity of the imperial institution. By keeping the visit private, he avoided the spectacle that would have inevitably accompanied any public meeting. In early December 1992, Jackson received the response to his letter, which included the extraordinary invitation for a private audience at the Imperial Palace. According to those close to him at the time, he was both honored and somewhat intimidated by the prospect. "Michael was absolutely stunned," said one former assistant. He had hoped for some kind of response, maybe from a cultural attaché or imperial secretary, but a personal invitation from the emperor himself? He immediately began researching proper protocol and etiquette. He wanted to ensure he would show appropriate respect. Jackson's reaction revealed a side of him rarely seen by the public, an almost scholarly dedication to understanding cultural traditions and protocols. He reportedly consulted with experts on Japanese court etiquette, practiced the proper bows and greetings, and studied the complex rules governing interaction with the imperial family. He approached it like preparing for a performance, said one associate. He wanted every gesture, every word to be perfect. But there was also a childlike excitement. This wasn't about publicity or career advancement. It was about connecting with a cultural tradition he genuinely respected. The preparations for the visit were conducted with extraordinary secrecy. Only a handful of people on either side were informed of the planned meeting. Jackson was advised to bring no more than 2 personal staff members. The visit was scheduled for December 20th to 22nd, 1992, a period when the emperor's official calendar was relatively quiet, allowing for the private nature of the engagement. This timing was deliberate on both sides. For the imperial household, it represented a period with fewer official duties, reducing the number of staff who would need to be informed about the unusual visitor. For Jackson, it came during a brief break in his dangerous world tour schedule, allowing him to visit Japan without the entourage and media attention that accompanied his professional appearances. Jackson arrived in Tokyo on December 19 under the pretense of a private shopping trip and potential business meetings, a common enough occurrence to avoid special attention. The following day, a nondescript vehicle transported him and two aides to a private entrance of the Imperial Palace grounds, avoiding the main gates where tourists and officials typically entered. The Imperial Palace, situated in the heart of Tokyo, occupies the site of the old Edo Castle, the seat of the Tokugawa shogunate that ruled Japan from 1603 until the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Surrounded by stone walls and moats, the palace grounds cover approximately 1.15 square kilometers of prime Tokyo real estate. Within this extensive complex lie not only the formal ceremonial spaces where the emperor performs official duties but also the private residences and gardens where the imperial family lives. What transpired over the next 3 days has never been fully disclosed, with both the imperial household and Jackson's estate maintaining the confidentiality that characterized the visit. However, through interviews with various staff members who were present in limited capacities and through diplomatic sources who later became aware of the meeting, a fascinating picture emerges of this unlikely cultural exchange. The first meeting between Jackson and Emperor Akihito reportedly took place in a traditional Japanese tea room within the private imperial residence. Present were only the emperor, the empress, Jackson, and 2 interpreters, one from each side to ensure accurate communication. The setting itself represented a careful balance of formality and intimacy. The traditional tea room, with its tatami mats, minimal decoration, and carefully arranged flower arrangement, ikebana, embodied the Japanese aesthetic principles of simplicity and harmony. By receiving Jackson in this setting rather than in one of the more formal audience chambers used for official state visits, the emperor signaled both respect for tradition and a desire for more personal interaction. The initial moments were somewhat awkward, recalled one of the interpreters years later. Here was Michael Jackson, arguably the most famous entertainer in the world, clearly nervous and making every effort to observe proper etiquette. And here was the emperor, representing 1,000 years of tradition, sincerely interested in understanding contemporary global culture through one of its most prominent figures. Jackson, dressed conservatively in a dark suit rather than his typical performance attire, reportedly performed the formal bow perfectly, having practiced extensively. The emperor, known for his relatively informal approach compared to his predecessors, responded with a warm greeting that helped ease the initial tension. The ice was broken, surprisingly, through a discussion of gardening. Jackson had recently expanded the gardens at his Neverland Ranch and spoke of his interest in creating spaces of natural beauty. Emperor Akihito, known for his own horticultural interests, engaged enthusiastically on this topic. What began as polite small talk evolved into a more substantive discussion about the philosophical aspects of garden design in different cultures, the Western emphasis on symmetry and control versus the Japanese tradition of working with natural forms and creating harmonious imbalance. It was remarkable to see how quickly they found common ground on this seemingly mundane topic, said one attendant who was briefly present. The emperor was explaining concepts of Japanese garden design, how a garden should reveal itself gradually, never being fully visible from any single vantage point, and Michael was connecting this to his own thoughts about how music should unfold over time, revealing new elements with each listening. This initial conversation set the tone for what would become 3 days of genuine cultural exchange that went far beyond what either side had anticipated. The planned brief audience evolved, at the emperor's suggestion, into a more extended interaction that would include various aspects of Japanese cultural tradition. The emperor arranged for Jackson to tour parts of the palace not open to the public, including the private imperial music collection, which contains instruments and scores dating back centuries. Jackson, in turn, shared insights into his creative process and the technical aspects of contemporary music production, subjects that fascinated the emperor, who had a lifelong interest in the scientific aspects of various disciplines. The music collection, housed in a specially climate-controlled section of the palace, contains instruments that represent the evolution of Japanese musical tradition from ancient court music to modern compositions. Of particular interest to Jackson were the various percussion instruments, including taiko drums and smaller hand drums used in traditional theater forms. What was remarkable was how quickly they found common ground, said an Imperial household staff member who assisted with the visit. They both had lived their entire lives in unique positions, born into or thrust into roles that separated them from ordinary experience. There was a mutual recognition of that unusual shared circumstance, despite all their obvious differences. This recognition of shared experience, the emperor born into an ancient lineage that defined his life from birth, Jackson thrust into celebrity from childhood that similarly constrained his existence, created a foundation for unusually candid conversation. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, both men had lived lives defined by public expectations and limited privacy. On the second day, Jackson was invited to a private demonstration of traditional Japanese court music, gagaku, the oldest continuous orchestral tradition in the world, dating back to the 7th century. The performance took place in one of the palace's music halls, with only a small group of court musicians who had been sworn to secrecy about their unusual audience. Gagaku, with its distinctive combination of wind, string, and percussion instruments producing music that sounds otherworldly to modern ears, represents a direct connection to Japan's ancient past. The instruments and compositions have been preserved through the imperial court's patronage for over a millennium, passed down through generations of musicians often from the same families. The performers, initially skeptical about playing for a Western pop star, were reportedly moved by Jackson's genuine engagement and thoughtful questions about their ancient art form. The musicians were prepared to be dismissive, said one Imperial household staff member who observed the demonstration. But Jackson's questions showed real understanding of the challenges of preserving traditional arts. He asked about how they balance fidelity to ancient compositions with making the music accessible to contemporary ears, a question that reflected his own balancing of artistic innovation with commercial appeal. Following the performance, Jackson engaged with the musicians directly, asking to examine some of the instruments and inquiring about their construction and playing techniques. His particular interest in the rhythmic aspects of gagaku led to an impromptu discussion of how various cultures develop distinct approaches to rhythm and timing. In return, Jackson gave an impromptu demonstration of his own art form. Without the elaborate production of his staged performances, he explained and demonstrated his distinctive dance techniques, including the moonwalk, breaking down the technical elements in a way that presented them as a serious choreographic tradition rather than merely popular entertainment. This demonstration took place in the same music hall, with the emperor, empress, and the gagaku musicians as his only audience. Jackson began by explaining the influences on his dance style, tracing connections to earlier traditions from tap dance to James Brown's innovations to traditional African dance movements. It was extraordinary to see these two traditions, imperial court music dating back 1,000 years and contemporary pop performance, being exchanged with mutual respect, noted one witness. The emperor was particularly interested in how Jackson had synthesized influences from various dance traditions, from James Brown to Fred Astaire to classical ballet. The evening of the second day included a private dinner with the imperial couple in one of the smaller dining rooms of the palace. The menu combined traditional Japanese kaiseki cuisine with some Western elements, reflecting the cross-cultural nature of the visit. The conversation reportedly ranged from the philosophical to the personal, with discussions of art's role in society, the challenges of public life, and the importance of cultural understanding in an increasingly globalized world. There was a moment during dinner when the Empress asked Michael about his childhood performances, and he spoke quite openly about the mixed blessing of early fame, said one staff member who was present. The Emperor then shared some thoughts about his own experience being prepared for a role from childhood, and there was this moment of recognition between them, two people whose lives had been defined by expectations placed on them from a very young age. The third day included a private tour of the imperial gardens, led by the emperor himself rather than the usual garden attendants. Here, amid the carefully tended landscape that represents centuries of Japanese aesthetic tradition, the conversation reportedly turned to more personal matters, the challenges of raising children in unusual circumstances, the difficulty of finding privacy in highly public roles, and the weight of expectations that came with their respective positions. The East Gardens of the Imperial Palace, while occasionally open to the public, contain sections that remain private for the imperial family's use. These areas, with their carefully composed landscapes representing mountains, rivers, and forests in miniature, embody the Japanese aesthetic principle of suggesting vast natural scenes within limited space. There was a moment when they were walking by the garden's pond, recalled one staff member, when the emperor asked Michael about how he handled being seen as a symbol rather than a person. It was a question perhaps only someone in the emperor's position could genuinely understand asking. Michael's answer was quite thoughtful, about creating a private self separate from the public persona, about finding spaces where you could simply be human. Jackson reportedly spoke of his Neverland Ranch as his attempt to create a space where he could reclaim aspects of a childhood he felt had been sacrificed to his career. The emperor, in turn, shared his own efforts to carve out private family moments within the highly structured and traditional constraints of imperial life. This conversation seemed to cement a genuine connection between the two men, transcending the formal nature of their initial interactions. By the end of the 3-day visit, what had begun as an unusual diplomatic courtesy had evolved into something that those present described as a genuine friendship, albeit one constrained by the realities of their respective positions. The afternoon of the 3rd day included a special cultural presentation arranged at the emperor's request. Selected artists from various traditional Japanese art forms, including kabuki theater, bunraku puppet theater, and traditional dance, gave brief demonstrations of their crafts. This was followed by a discussion about the challenges of preserving traditional arts in contemporary society, a subject of deep interest to both the emperor and Jackson. Michael was particularly moved by the bunraku puppetry, said one observer. He was fascinated by how multiple puppeteers work in perfect coordination to create the illusion of a single living character. He commented that it reminded him of how various technical elements need to come together seamlessly in modern stage productions, the same principle applied across centuries of theatrical tradition. As Jackson prepared to depart on the evening of December 22, the emperor presented him with a gift, a small but exquisite 18th-century scroll painting depicting musicians at the ancient imperial court. Such an item, from the imperial collection, was an extraordinary gesture that recognized Jackson not merely as a celebrity but as an artist worthy of being connected to Japan's cultural heritage. The scroll, created during the Edo period by a court artist, depicted a gagaku performance similar to the one Jackson had witnessed. Its presentation in a custom-made wooden case with the imperial chrysanthemum seal represented a significant honor, as items from the imperial collection are rarely given to individuals outside the imperial family or visiting heads of state. Jackson, having anticipated the need for an appropriate gift, presented the emperor with a custom-made crystal sculpture he had commissioned, representing musical notes suspended in glass, a modern artistic expression of the harmony they had discussed. The sculpture, created by a renowned American glass artist, featured musical notation from both Western and traditional Japanese musical forms, visually intertwined within the clear crystal. It represented the bridge between traditions that their meeting had embodied. The emperor was visibly moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift, said one witness to the exchange. He commented that it beautifully represented the conversation between tradition and innovation, between East and West, that their meeting embodied. With a formal but now warmly familiar farewell, Jackson departed the imperial palace as discreetly as he had arrived. Both sides maintained the agreed-upon confidentiality, with no press releases or public acknowledgement of the visit. The impact of this extraordinary meeting extended far beyond the 3 days of direct interaction. For both Jackson and Emperor Akihito, it represented a rare opportunity for authentic exchange outside the constraints of their public roles, with lasting influences on their perspectives and actions. The impacts of this extraordinary meeting rippled outward in subtle but significant ways. In the months following the visit, Jackson's interest in Japanese culture deepened further. He began incorporating elements of Japanese artistic principles into his work, most notably in the short films and design aesthetics for his later projects. His personal collection of Japanese art expanded substantially, and he engaged more deeply with contemporary Japanese artists and musicians. Those familiar with Jackson's creative process noted subtle but significant shifts in his aesthetic approaches following his imperial visit. The video for Scream, his 1995 collaboration with his sister Janet, incorporated visual elements reminiscent of Japanese minimalist design. His stage designs for later tours included moments of deliberate emptiness and asymmetry that reflected Japanese spatial concepts. There was a noticeable shift in how Michael approached visual composition after that Japan trip, said one longtime creative collaborator. He became more interested in the power of negative space, in suggesting rather than explicitly showing. He would talk about the Japanese concept of hama, the meaningful space between elements, and how it could be applied to staging and choreography. More personally, Jackson reportedly maintained a special interest in the Japanese imperial family's activities, following news of their public appearances and cultural initiatives with particular attention. He kept the scroll painting he had received in a place of honor in his private study, often showing it to visitors as one of his most treasured possessions. For Emperor Akihito, the meeting represented a private embodiment of his broader effort to make the imperial institution more accessible and connected to contemporary global culture while maintaining its essential dignity and traditions. While never publicly referencing the meeting with Jackson, he subsequently showed increased interest in how traditional Japanese arts could engage with contemporary cultural expressions. In the years following the meeting, Emperor Akihito supported several initiatives that brought traditional Japanese art forms into dialogue with contemporary practices. The Imperial Household Agency, while maintaining its generally conservative approach, showed marginally increased openness to cultural innovation in its patronage of the arts. There was a subtle but noticeable shift in some of the emperor's cultural patronage after that period, noted one Japanese cultural administrator. While always deeply respectful of tradition, he seemed more interested in artists who were finding ways to make traditional forms speak to contemporary audiences. He never mentioned Jackson specifically, of course, but those of us who worked in cultural fields could sense a slightly broader perspective. On a diplomatic level, the private cultural exchange had unexpected ripple effects. When word of the meeting eventually filtered through diplomatic channels, though never reaching the public or press, it was seen as an example of cultural diplomacy that bypassed usual formal structures to create genuine understanding. The U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, upon learning of the meeting through unofficial channels, recognized its potential significance for cultural relations. While respecting the private nature of the exchange, diplomatic staff made subtle references to the importance of cultural understanding in subsequent official communications, acknowledging the role of artistic exchange in building bridges between different traditions. It represented a kind of soft diplomacy that formal state visits often fail to achieve, noted one former U.S. diplomatic official who later learned of the meeting. Two globally recognized individuals, each representing different aspects of their national cultures, engaging directly and genuinely, it created a different kind of cultural bridge. This model of personal, culture-focused exchange influenced certain diplomatic initiatives in subsequent years. While never explicitly referencing the Jackson-Akihito meeting, some U.S.-Japan cultural exchange programs adopted a similar emphasis on direct artistic engagement rather than formal ceremonial interactions. Jackson returned to Japan multiple times in subsequent years, and while he never again had such an extended private audience with the emperor, they reportedly exchanged occasional correspondence. During Jackson's 1996 tour of Japan, the imperial household arranged for him to have a private after-hours tour of national cultural treasures, an unusual courtesy that was seen by those aware of the background as a continuation of the relationship established in 1992. This ongoing connection, while maintained with the utmost discretion, occasionally manifested in small public ways. During a 1998 press conference in Tokyo, Jackson made an unusually specific reference to the importance of preserving traditional culture alongside innovation, a theme that echoed his conversations with the emperor. When asked about his interest in Japanese culture, he spoke with uncharacteristic detail about specific traditional art forms, revealing a knowledge that surprised many observers. The story of Michael Jackson's 3 days at the Imperial Palace remained largely unknown to the public for years. It was only after his death in 2009 that hints began to emerge, primarily through the careful comments of former staff members who felt free to speak about the event now that both principal figures were no longer in their former positions, Emperor Akihito having begun the process that would lead to his 2019 abdication. Even today, the full details of what was discussed during those 3 days remain private, honored by the discretion that characterized the visit itself. What has emerged is a portrait of an unlikely but genuine connection between two men who, despite coming from vastly different traditions and backgrounds, recognized in each other the unique experience of living public lives defined by their symbolic roles while seeking to maintain their humanity and artistic integrity. In many ways, it was a meeting that could only have happened at that specific moment, reflected one cultural historian who has studied the limited available information about the visit. You had an emperor working to modernize an ancient institution without losing its essential character, and an artist at the height of global fame trying to connect his innovative work to deeper artistic traditions. They each had something the other was seeking. The Japanese imperial tradition, dating back to 660 BCE according to traditional chronology, though historians place its verifiable origins closer to the 5th century CE, represents the world's oldest continuous hereditary monarchy. Throughout its history, the imperial institution has adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining its central symbolic importance in Japanese culture. Emperor Akihito's reign, 1989 to 2019, represented a period of careful modernization within this tradition, balancing respect for ancient practices with recognition of Japan's contemporary role in global society. Michael Jackson's career, while spanning a much briefer period, similarly represented both innovation and tradition. While continuously pushing the boundaries of performance and production, his work remained rooted in earlier musical traditions from gospel to R&B to disco. His global fame made him a symbol of American pop culture while his personal artistic journey involved seeking connections to deeper and more diverse cultural traditions. The meeting of these two figures, one representing the world's oldest continuous monarchy, the other the pinnacle of contemporary global fame, created a unique moment of cultural dialogue that transcended ordinary categories of exchange. Neither a formal diplomatic event nor a typical celebrity meeting, it represented a genuine attempt at cross-cultural and cross-generational understanding. The legacy of this unique cultural exchange lives on primarily in its influence on both participants rather than in public records or accounts. For Jackson, it reportedly reinforced his view that his work existed within a continuum of artistic and performance traditions that transcended contemporary pop categories. For Emperor Akihito, it represented an example of his belief that the imperial tradition could engage meaningfully with contemporary culture while maintaining its essential dignity. Perhaps most significantly, the meeting stands as a reminder of how authentic cultural exchange can occur in unexpected ways when individuals reach across conventional boundaries with genuine curiosity and respect. In a world increasingly defined by official protocols and public performances of diplomacy, the private connection between the Emperor of Japan and the King of Pop represents a different model of cultural understanding, one based on shared human experience rather than formal roles. As one former imperial household staff member poetically observed, the emperor comes from a tradition that believes in the power of moments that are not seen, that exist in the space between public appearances. Perhaps that is why he understood Michael Jackson, who lived his life in the spotlight but was always seeking authentic connection away from it. Their meeting existed in that private space where genuine understanding can occur, away from the distorting lens of public attention. In 2019, when Emperor Akihito became the first Japanese emperor to abdicate in over 2 centuries, passing the throne to his son Naruhito, some observers noted his unique legacy of cultural openness alongside traditional dignity. While his meeting with Michael Jackson represented only a small, private moment in his 30-year reign, it embodied the approach that characterized his time as emperor, finding ways to honor tradition while engaging thoughtfully with the contemporary world. 10 years after Jackson's death and in the final months of Akihito's reign, a small exhibition at a private Tokyo gallery displayed historical examples of cultural exchange between Japan and the world. In one corner, easily missed by casual visitors, was a crystal sculpture featuring intertwined musical notations from Eastern and Western traditions. The descriptive text simply identified it as a gift from an American artist to Japan, representing harmony across traditions. For the very few who knew the full story, it stood as a discreet testament to 3 remarkable days when the world's oldest royal line and the world's biggest pop star found unexpected common ground in their shared humanity and love of artistic tradition.